one of the largest foes that an artist can face is this idea of burnout. But it's still something that can be relatively undefined, undiagnosed, and dismissed as other things. Sometimes the worst time to deal with burnout is when you're in the thick of it. And so I want to provide some help understanding and combating burnout, whether you're dealing with it now or to prepare you for it, when it will, for a certainty, happen, unfortunately, in the future. Burnout can mean so many things to a lot of people, but it's actually a relatively new concept. The first studies on burnout came from the 70s and 80s. And can you guess what industry that they first focused on? It actually isn't one that we usually associate with creative work. It was nursing and healthcare professionals. Now maybe that strikes you as odd at first, but think about these aspects of hospital work. Long hours, sometimes mentally taxing or intense tasks, and you're often dealing with other people empathetically, other humans. And while creative work is very different functionally from that of a healthcare worker, creating things with the intent to cause others, an audience, a client, to care, to be satisfied, to create a reaction, is a very empathetic activity. Success and failure of these things affect us, sometimes more personally than others. And there's an aspect of self wrapped up in our work as well. So burnout comes from the reserves of creative or emotional energy being depleted. Now functionally, a lot of times it can resemble feelings of depression because there is a lack or nothing left to give. If you think about physical energy, oftentimes if we do too much, purely physical in a day, we push ourselves, we can become exhausted easily. So say you biked for 10 miles in a day, likely at the end of it, you're just going to collapse. You have nothing left to give. So even if you were a trained cyclist, that's still a lot. And the amount of rest that your body needs to be fully restored is quite a bit. And there's kind of no going around that. So imagine how well you'd do if after biking for 10 miles, you get home, fall asleep for about 45 minutes, and then someone wakes you up and tells you that you need to get back on your bike and keep going, or that it's time to do something completely different like weightlifting. How well would you do? It sounds awful to me. You just didn't give yourself enough of a chance to recuperate. And to say nothing of what happens when we're sleep deprived. We can be delirious, unfocused, inefficient, and emotionally sporadic. The same thing happens with burnout, but because the symptoms and effects aren't physical, they aren't as easy to notice, and oftentimes we keep going until it's too late and we're burnt out. So I have 3 things that I desperately hope can help you combat burnout, because it is a feeling that I would not wish on my worst enemy. The first of these things is time and rest. Somewhat obvious following our sleep analogy, but we need these things in order to perform creatively. One of the quickest and easiest ways that I burn out is by spending too much time on a creative project or work. Often when a client needs something and I'm pulling crazy crunch time and all-nighters, that's an immediate recipe for burnout. But it doesn't seem like it in the thick of things. The same as physical sleep deprivation, adrenaline kicks in and you're excited to finish this thing. And you dig deep and push past a lot of boundaries. And you even think things like, this creative work, this is my favorite kind of work. You might even just say that I could keep this schedule up forever and be happy with it. It's just a privilege to be able to do it. But give it a few days, a week, even a month, and it's like you've hit a wall. Now, as much as it's possible, put boundaries on the time that you spend creatively, especially if the work that you're doing for a living is creative too. This includes art, teaching, which is also a very empathetic work, trying to think like and benefit a student, right? Things like making videos, being self-employed where you need to do kind of a degree of creative thinking to get your next meal. I guess I do all those things. Fantastic. And anytime you do overextend yourself in the amount of time you spend, understand that it's imperative that you budget out time afterwards to recuperate. You also need legitimate rest with a capital R. Now, for example, the following things are not rest: watching TV, browsing the internet, screaming back and forth at other people on Twitter, refreshing a news feed, reading other people's screaming matches back and forth at each other on Twitter, spending precious energy trying to figure out how idiotic someone would have to be to say some of the things that they do, spending precious energy trying to figure out why someone would make the decisions that they do, reading the comment section on YouTube videos. I mean, not your comments. You guys are always wonderful. Except for every time I go to redesign a character, like, what kind of statement is it to say, it's good, but it's not the same as the original? Like, that was the entire point of redesigning it. Did you want an exact JPEG of Mario next to the original as the redesign? Do you understand this exercise? See, a lot of times we go to our phones or something electronic in a period of downtime, and not only is it easy to come across something that actually costs you mental and emotional energy, or something that causes feelings of anxiety, it's not real rest. It's not a void of expenditure, and it's not restorative. A recent study showed that people who spend at least 2 hours a week surrounded by nature, unplugged, had much better physical and emotional health. Now, I'm not saying kids today and their technology equals bad. I love these things and get great use from them too. But you know what's had a big uptick since the initial awareness of burnout in the 70s and 80s? Information. Advertising, opinions, consumer content, things that ask and demand to have a tiny sliver or giant chunk of your brain. And all too easy, the treadmill starts moving faster than you can process. Give yourself time to process. Give yourself time to rest. Number 2 is balance. We already talked about budgeting time to balance out the time spent on creative things. But going back to our biking analogy, you could rest all you want, but there's something else that you need to succeed physically, which is food. Good, nutritious food. Now, for creative work, sometimes the food that benefits us is inspiration, other people's creative work. But even better than that is the same recipe that we use for revenge, right? The best revenge is a life well lived. Well, time and experience from a balanced, well-lived life is the main ingredient to healthy creative work. Ultimately, creative stuff is a personalized, filtered version of your experiences. So spend time with family and friends, do stuff, exercise a bit to clear your mind, feed yourself both physically and mentally with the same things that started your creative fire in the first place. The third thing is perhaps the most insidious and difficult to define and solve if you aren't actively working on it, and that's focus. What would even cause someone to bike for 10 miles in a day if they didn't want to? What causes someone to do that, to leave their comfort zone and push themselves and even risk failing? Well, it takes motivation, something that creative work also requires. And usually in the depths of burnout is when you feel the least motivated. You've given all you can and those reserves, tanks, batteries are empty. Even with a deadline looming, promises made, it feels like it'd be easier to lift a truck than to actually do this work. So especially if your recent or long-term efforts aren't going as well as you thought, or it seems like nothing you do matters, it's easy to say, why am I even doing this? Which is the exact time, if not earlier, that you need to sit down with that question face to face and have a stern talk. Why am I doing this? And be honest. Usually after doing this work for a while, it's easy to lose focus on the reason you started in the first place. Sometimes all it takes is a reminder. Other times it may mean a slight shift or pivot. You've realized that you need to refine the reason that you started as you've learned more about yourself through the act of doing the work. And most importantly, you need to set tangible, short-term and long-term goals for yourself. You need a finish line on the 10th mile. You need a GPS pointing you to that line, or else you'll just bike around aimlessly. Or worse, you'll end up on the street near me that's not meant for bikes. It's skinny, it's a 2-lane road, there's no room for you, it's a Saturday, there are 12 cars backed up behind you, have some self-awareness, find a bike trail, this is a safety issue. A lot of people talk about being passionate about their work, and sometimes it's unrealistic to be passionate 24/7. But if you've lost the motivation to do your work, it can feel like you're spinning your wheels, and that will drain you much quicker than anything else. If it feels like you're going through the motions, or the situation or environment is taxing you more emotionally than it's worth, or even toxic, it may mean drastic action is necessary on your part to keep you from burning out even further. If you take away anything from this discussion, I want you to keep the idea of a battery or a reserve tank in mind, because I think it's so apt. None of us are more special than anyone else at these things. We all have limits. And say you only filled up the gas tank in your car 1 gallon at a time, or I guess 1 liter at a time. How often would you run out and need to refuel again? Or if you could only charge your phone 10% at a time, how much use would you get out of it? And how anxious would you be redlining it to keep the thing alive? The worst thing about burnout is that when you're in the thick of it, everything feels gray, pointless, impossible, as though you'll never do anything creatively again. And trying to push past that while in a state of burnout can do long-term damage to yourself. But the best thing about burnout, not dwelling too much on that feeling you're probably all too familiar with, is that it's something you learn more about and are more prepared for every time it happens. You start to recognize the signs earlier and earlier. It's like your toes being cold. It's the first sign that your body isn't warm enough. And if you aren't careful, you could die of hypothermia, or you could put on a pair of socks. You could deal with the problem before it gets worse. If you're struggling with burnout yourself, I feel for you. Please seek out time, rest, balance, and focus. If this video helped you, please give it a like and perhaps share it with someone who you think it could help. You can also keep my forge burning over on patreon.com/bageldenizen, where I have a lot of exciting new things planned coming up. If you're still hoping to get a personalized video critique at the current level that it's at, I'd suggest hopping in soon. Also, if you're struggling with not burnout, but creative block, or you're up against a problem you can't really figure out, I'd highly recommend a video that I made last month called "Anytime You're Struggling with Art, Use This," which I'll link below.